All right, gather round, you intrepid explorers of the past, you daring connoisseurs of the grim and the grisly. Welcome back to Beyond Midnight, where we peel back the layers of romanticized history to reveal the festering, barnacle-encrusted truth beneath. Tonight, we're not just sailing the high seas, we're plunging headfirst into the putrid depths of a pirate's existence. Forget your swashbuckling heroes, your charming rogues with parrots on their shoulders and hearts of gold. We're talking about the real deal, the kind of life that would make your average influencer, or indeed, your average human being with a basic understanding of sanitation and personal space, spontaneously combust from sheer existential dread. Because let's be brutally honest, you wouldn't last a day on a pirate ship. Not an hour, probably. You'd be a quivering, seasick, lice-ridden mess, begging for the sweet release of a well-aimed cannonball before the sun had even properly cleared the horizon. And I'm not saying that to be mean, mind you. I'm saying it because history, in its infinite wisdom and utter disregard for your delicate sensibilities, proves it. So let's set the scene, shall we? You, yes you, with your freshly laundered clothes and your carefully curated playlist, wake up not in your ergonomically designed bed, but in a damp, reeking, perpetually swaying wooden box. The first thing that assaults you isn't the gentle chirping of birds or the comforting aroma of your morning coffee. Oh no, the first thing is the smell. It's a multi-layered, symphonic assault on your olfactory nerves, a veritable olfactive opera of despair. You've got the baseline notes of stale bilge water, a concoction of seawater, rat droppings, human waste, and whatever unidentifiable biological horrors have been breeding in the dark, damp recesses below deck. Then there's the pungent tang of unwashed bodies, hundreds of them, crammed together, sweating, festering, never knowing the sweet embrace of soap and fresh water. Imagine the collective body odor of 1,000 unbathed gym socks left to ferment in a swamp, then multiply that by 10 and add a generous helping of fear-induced sweat. But wait, there's more. Layered on top of this delightful bouquet, you'll find the metallic tang of dried blood from yesterday's skirmish, the cloying sweetness of stale rum and vomit, the acrid bite of gunpowder residue, the greasy smell of rancid salt pork, and the faint, unsettling aroma of rot, whether it's from the timber, the provisions, or perhaps a shipmate who didn't quite make it through the night. You're not entirely sure. This isn't a smell you get used to. It's a smell that infiltrates your clothes, your hair, your very pores, becoming a permanent part of your being. You'd spend the rest of your life, should you somehow survive, smelling faintly of desperation and despair. Your modern nose, accustomed to air fresheners and fabric softeners, would simply give up, declaring a state of emergency and shutting down your entire respiratory system. Good luck breathing through that. And then there's the sound. Oh, the glorious symphony of the high seas, not the gentle lapping of waves you hear on a cruise ship commercial. No, this is the constant, relentless groan and creak of stressed timbers, the whine of the wind through the rigging, the relentless slap and crash of waves against the hull, occasionally punctuated by a rogue wave washing over the deck, sending icy spray and splintered wood flying. Below deck, it's a cacophony of shouts, curses, the rhythmic thump of footsteps above, the scratching and scurrying of rats, because, let's be clear, you were never alone on a pirate ship. The rats were your constant companions, bold and numerous, gnawing through ropes, provisions, and occasionally, if you were particularly unlucky, through your very toes as you slept. Try getting a solid 8 hours of REM sleep with a family of rodents engaged in a nightly rave around your hammock. Speaking of sleep, let's talk about your luxurious quarters. There are no private cabins here, no memory foam mattresses. You'd be sharing a cramped, perpetually damp space with dozens of other unwashed, often ill-tempered men. Your bed, a hammock, a canvas sling, strung up in a tangled mess with dozens of others, swaying precariously with every roll of the ship. Imagine trying to sleep in a constantly rocking, claustrophobic sardine can, with the stench of human misery permeating every fiber of your being, and the constant threat of a violent storm, a surprise attack, or simply being crushed by a falling barrel. The concept of personal space was a quaint theoretical notion, much like dental hygiene or not having scurvy. You'd be pressed up against strangers, their limbs tangled with yours, their snores competing with the general din, their lice perhaps migrating to new, greener pastures on your scalp. Sweet dreams indeed. And let's not even begin to address the hygiene, or rather the utter, complete, and total lack thereof. There were no showers, no sinks, no bidets, no scented soaps, no exfoliating scrubs. Your bath might consist of a bucket of seawater thrown over you on deck if you were lucky, and if the weather permitted, which it often didn't. Most pirates went weeks, if not months, without anything resembling a proper wash. Your clothes, stiff with salt, sweat, and grime, were worn until they literally fell off your body. Imagine the chafing. Imagine the rashes. Imagine the sheer, unadulterated itchiness. You'd be a walking, talking, scratching ecosystem of lice, fleas, and every other parasitic creature known to man. Your skin, accustomed to the gentle caress of moisturizer, would quickly become a landscape of boils, sores, and open wounds, festering in the constant damp and filth. A modern person, even one who occasionally forgets to shower after the gym, would find this level of pervasive uncleanliness utterly soul-destroying. Your immune system, coddled by antibiotics and sterile environments, would simply surrender, throwing up its hands in despair. Now let's move on to the culinary delights awaiting you. Forget your artisanal sourdough, your gluten-free quinoa bowls, your ethically sourced organic kale. On a pirate ship, your staple diet consisted primarily of hardtack and salted meat. Hardtack, or ship's biscuit, was a flour and water cracker, baked until it was, well, hard as a rock. The idea was that it wouldn't spoil. The reality was that it became a breeding ground for weevils. Yes, weevils. Little beetle larvae that would burrow through the biscuit, leaving tiny tunnels and a rather unpleasant, protein-rich crunch. You'd learn to tap your biscuit against the table to dislodge the larger, more visible ones, but many would remain, offering that extra oomph to your meal. You think you're a picky eater now. Try explaining your dietary preferences to a quartermaster whose idea of a gourmet meal is a biscuit that doesn't actively move on its own. The salted meat, usually pork or beef, was often months, if not years, old. Preserved in brine, it was tough, stringy, and frequently rancid. To make it remotely palatable, it would be soaked in seawater to draw out some of the salt, then boiled. The result was a gray, unappetizing slab of something. Fresh food was a rare luxury, acquired only when landing on an island or plundering a merchant ship with a fresh cargo. This monotonous, nutrient-deficient diet led to the scourge of the seas, scurvy. Scurvy, the pirate's inevitable companion. Not just a vague historical ailment, but a truly horrific slow death. Imagine your gums bleeding, your teeth loosening and falling out, your skin breaking out in dark, bruised patches, old wounds reopening and refusing to heal, your joints swelling and aching, making every movement agony, your body slowly degenerating, becoming weak, lethargic, and eventually dying from internal hemorrhaging. All because of a simple lack of vitamin C. Your modern diet, with its abundance of fruits and vegetables, would render you utterly unprepared for this slow, agonizing descent into physical decay. You'd be dreaming of oranges and limes, while your shipmates watched your teeth fall out, perhaps placing bets on when your next limb would swell to twice its size. And what about drink? Water, precious water, was stored in wooden casks and quickly became stagnant, slimy, and often filled with algae or worse. To mask the foul taste and kill some of the bacteria, it was often mixed with rum, creating grog. So while you might not die of thirst immediately, you'd be constantly dehydrated, often mildly intoxicated, and battling chronic dysentery from the contaminated water. Forget your sparkling mineral water or your oat milk lattes. Your hydration strategy would involve chugging warm, algae-infused rum water, hoping it didn't send you to the head, which, by the way, was usually just a plank over the side of the ship, offering little privacy and maximum exposure to the elements. Now let's consider the medical care, or, as it was more accurately known, the hope you die quickly service. There were no paramedics, no sterile operating theaters, no pain medication beyond a generous swig of rum if you were lucky and the captain felt generous. The ship's surgeon was often the cook, the carpenter, or simply the crewman with the steadiest hand and the strongest stomach. Their tools, a rusty saw, a sharp knife, a needle and thread, their medical knowledge. Primarily based on superstition, guesswork, and a rudimentary understanding of anatomy gained from previous, often fatal, experiences. A simple cut, a splinter, a rope burn, all potential death sentences. Infections were rampant. Gangrene was a common outcome of even minor injuries. Imagine a deep cut on your leg. Within days it would fester, turn black, and the smell would be unmistakable. The solution, amputation, without anesthetic, mind you. You'd be held down by several burly shipmates, a leather strap clenched between your teeth as the surgeon sawed through bone and muscle. The pain would be unimaginable, a searing, white-hot agony that would make you beg for unconsciousness. If you survived the initial shock, you then faced the very high probability of dying from blood loss, infection, or simply the sheer trauma to your system. Your modern sensibilities, which demand immediate pain relief for a stubbed toe, would simply short-circuit. You'd probably pass out at the sight of the saw, let alone the application. And it wasn't just injuries. Diseases swept through ships like wildfire. Typhus, smallpox, yellow fever, dysentery, all thriving in the close quarters and unsanitary conditions. A single sick man could doom an entire crew. There was no understanding of germ theory, no antibiotics, no vaccines. If you got sick, you either recovered through sheer luck and a robust immune system, or you died. And if you died, you were unceremoniously wrapped in a canvas shroud, perhaps with a cannonball at your feet, and slipped overboard. No elaborate funeral, no grieving period, just another body for the sharks. Your expectation of modern medical intervention, of a doctor who actually knows what they're doing, would be met with a grim, knowing chuckle from your pirate shipmates, followed by a shrug and perhaps a swig of grog. Beyond the physical discomforts, there was the constant, grinding psychological toll. Life on a pirate ship was a bizarre blend of soul-crushing boredom and sudden, heart-stopping terror. Days could stretch into weeks, weeks into months of nothing but the endless expanse of the ocean. The same faces, the same smells, the same routine. Imagine the mind-numbing monotony. No internet, no Netflix, no books, unless you found one in a captured cargo and could read by the dim light of a lantern. Gambling, drinking, and crude storytelling were the primary forms of entertainment. The only real excitement came from spotting a sail on the horizon, which could mean a lucrative prize, or a heavily armed warship coming to end your brief, miserable career. And when that terror struck, it was absolute. A storm could appear out of nowhere, transforming the ship from a floating home into a death trap. Masts splintering, sails tearing, waves crashing over the deck, threatening to sweep you overboard. You'd be clinging for dear life, soaked to the bone, battling the elements with every ounce of your strength, knowing that one wrong move could send you to a watery grave. Your fear of turbulence on a commercial flight would seem utterly trivial in comparison. Then there was combat. The romanticized image of pirates swinging from ropes, swords glinting in the sun, is a gross simplification. Real naval combat was a brutal, bloody affair. Cannonballs tearing through timber, sending splinters flying like shrapnel. Musket balls whizzing past, tearing flesh. The deafening roar of cannon fire, the acrid smell of gunpowder, the screams of the wounded. Boarding actions were a chaotic hand-to-hand brawl, a desperate struggle for survival. Cutlasses hacking, pistols firing at point-blank range, grappling hooks tearing into rigging. You wouldn't be a heroic swordsman. You'd be a terrified, untrained amateur, likely to trip over your own feet and get impaled before you even knew what was happening. And if you were wounded, well, we've already covered the medical care, haven't we? Your modern aversion to violence, your deeply ingrained respect for human life, would be severely tested, if not utterly shattered, within minutes of the first broadside. And let's not forget the ever-present threat of the gallows. If you were captured by the Royal Navy, your prospects were grim. A swift trial, often a foregone conclusion, followed by a public hanging. Your body would then be left to rot in a gibbet, a grim warning to any aspiring buccaneers. The freedom and riches of the pirate life were a fleeting illusion, constantly overshadowed by the very real possibility of a short, brutal end. Your modern concept of due process, of legal rights, would be laughed out of court, probably literally. The social dynamics on a pirate ship were also far from the democratic utopia often portrayed. While pirate crews did elect their captains and had a code of conduct, it was a fragile system held together by fear and mutual self-interest. The captain, though elected, held absolute power in battle. The quartermaster, elected by the crew, was responsible for discipline and distributing loot. But these were rough men, often desperate, and prone to sudden outbursts of violence. Disputes could escalate quickly, often settled with fists, knives, or pistols. Mutiny was a constant threat, and a captain who lost the respect of his crew wouldn't last long. Your finely honed conflict resolution skills, your ability to mediate disagreements with polite discourse, would be utterly useless. You'd either learn to fight, or you'd learn to keep your mouth shut and your head down. Imagine the sheer psychological pressure of living in such close quarters with men who were, by definition, outlaws. Men who had often committed heinous acts, men hardened by a life of brutality. Trust was a rare commodity, earned slowly and lost quickly. You'd constantly be on edge, watching your back, wondering who might betray you for a larger share of the loot or simply out of spite. Your innate desire for fairness, for justice, would be constantly challenged by the harsh realities of pirate law, which was often no law at all. And the boredom, that insidious, creeping boredom. When there wasn't a storm or a battle, there was just the ocean, endless, featureless, often gray. The days blurring into one another, the lack of intellectual stimulation, the absence of any meaningful pursuit beyond survival, and the fleeting hope of plunder. Your smartphone, your laptop, your entire digital world would be utterly useless. You'd be forced to confront your own thoughts, your own inner demons, with no distraction. For many, that alone would be a fate worse than scurvy. The reality of pirate life was a far cry from the romanticized image. It was a life of hardship, disease, violence, and constant danger. It was a choice made out of desperation, a gamble for a fleeting taste of freedom and wealth, often ending in a watery grave or the hangman's noose. You, with your creature comforts, your access to clean water, your understanding of basic hygiene, your expectation of medical care, your need for personal space, and your aversion to weevils in your biscuits would simply not endure. Your modern body, your modern mind would rebel. You'd be a liability, a whiner, a prime candidate for marooning on the nearest deserted island, which, ironically, might be a more merciful end. So the next time you see a charming pirate costume or watch a Hollywood blockbuster, remember the reality. Remember the smell, the filth, the disease, the constant threat of a gruesome death. Remember that the golden age of piracy was golden only for the select few who managed to survive long enough to squander their ill-gotten gains. For the vast majority, it was a short, brutal, and utterly miserable existence. And you, dear viewer, would be among the miserable. You'd be begging for a return to your cubicle, your traffic jams, your lukewarm coffee within hours. The call of the sea, once so alluring, would become a terrifying, gut-wrenching nightmare. We'll continue this delightful journey into the annals of maritime misery, because while we've scratched the surface of the putrid, we haven't quite plunged into the depths of utter, soul-crushing despair that would surely be your daily companion. Let's talk about your wardrobe, shall we? You, with your carefully chosen, breathable fabrics and your seasonal color palettes, would find yourself in a perpetual state of sartorial horror. There were no laundromats at sea, no dry cleaners, no concept of freshly pressed. Your clothes, if you were lucky enough to possess more than one set, would be a collection of patched, stiff, salt-encrusted rags. They'd be perpetually damp, whether from sea spray, sweat, or the insidious dampness that permeated every crevice of the ship. Imagine wearing the same clammy, scratchy, sweat-soaked garments for weeks, even months on end. The chafing alone would be enough to drive a lesser man, or indeed, you, to madness. Your skin, accustomed to the gentle caress of cot and the invigorating exfoliation of a loofah, would quickly develop a landscape of angry red welts, boils, and weeping sores, all rubbed raw by the abrasive fabric and the constant movement of the ship. And let's not forget the delightful, persistent itch of the aforementioned lice and fleas, who would find your unwashed attire a veritable five-star resort. You'd spend half your day scratching, a frantic, desperate dance that would leave your skin even more inflamed. And the weather, oh, the glorious, unpredictable, utterly unforgiving weather. You, accustomed to climate-controlled environments and the comforting presence of a roof over your head, would be at the mercy of the elements 24/7. Days of blistering sun, beating down on an open deck, would leave you with burns that blistered and peeled, adding another layer of discomfort to your already miserable existence. Sunstroke would be a very real threat, leaving you disoriented, nauseous, and utterly incapacitated. Your delicate skin, accustomed to SPF 50 and wide-brimmed hats, would simply surrender, transforming into a leathery, cracked mess. Then there were the storms, not just the big, dramatic ones we talked about, but the constant, smaller squalls, the incessant rain that lashed down, soaking you to the bone. There was no escape. Your clothes would be perpetually wet, clinging to your skin, chilling you to the core. Hypothermia, even in seemingly moderate temperatures, was a very real danger, especially when combined with exhaustion and poor nutrition. Imagine trying to sleep in a damp hammock, shivering uncontrollably, your teeth chattering, while the ship groaned and pitched around you. Your modern concept of bad weather, a slight drizzle, perhaps, would be utterly redefined by the sheer, relentless misery of a week-long tempest at sea. You'd be dreaming of a warm bath, a dry towel, and a mug of hot cocoa, while your reality offered only cold, wet misery and the distant prospect of a watery grave. And let's not delude ourselves into thinking that pirate life was all about swashbuckling and plundering. Oh no, the vast majority of your time would be spent in back-breaking, monotonous labor. This wasn't a leisure cruise. This was a working ship, and every man was expected to pull his weight and then some. You'd be hauling heavy ropes, often chafing your hands raw, leaving them blistered and bleeding. You'd be climbing rigging, often hundreds of feet above the deck, swaying precariously with every roll of the ship, with nothing but a thin rope between you and the churning abyss below. Your fear of heights, your lack of upper body strength, your general aversion to manual labor would be ruthlessly exposed. A single slip, a moment of vertigo, and you'd be gone, swallowed by the waves before anyone even noticed. You'd be constantly bailing water from the bilge, a filthy, stinking task that would leave you drenched in the ship's effluent. You'd be scrubbing the deck, scraping barnacles from the hull, a truly delightful task, involving being lowered over the side on a rope, often in shark-infested waters, mending torn sails, patching holes in the hull. Maintenance was constant, relentless, and absolutely essential for survival. There were no weekends, no sick days, no quitting time. Your work was your life, and your life was constant, grinding toil. Your modern appreciation for a 40-hour work week, for paid time off, for ergonomic chairs and climate-controlled offices, would feel like a cruel joke in the face of this ceaseless, brutal reality. Your hands, accustomed to keyboards and touchscreens, would be a mangled mess of calluses, cuts, and rope burns within days. And what about discipline? Ah, yes. The pirate code, often romanticized as a beacon of egalitarianism, was in reality a brutal, unforgiving set of rules enforced by the captain, often with the quartermaster as his enforcer. Disobedience, cowardice in battle, theft from a shipmate, or even just insubordination could be met with swift and horrifying punishment. Forget HR departments, formal warnings, or performance reviews. Here, your performance review might involve a cat o' nine tails. Flogging was a common punishment, a public display of pain designed to instill fear and obedience. Imagine being stripped to the waist, tied to the mast, and having your back flayed open by a whip, each lash tearing strips of flesh from your spine. The pain would be excruciating, the humiliation absolute. And then there was the ever-present threat of a worse fate. Marooning, for instance, wasn't just a plot device in a children's story. It was a very real, very terrifying punishment. You'd be left on a deserted island, often with nothing but a bottle of water and a pistol with a single shot, to either defend yourself or, more likely, end your misery. Your chances of survival were negligible. The slow, agonizing death by thirst, starvation, or exposure would be a grim alternative to the swiftness of the gallows. And while walking the plank might be more myth than common practice for historical pirates, the threat of it, or similar summary executions, certainly existed. Imagine being forced to choose between jumping into shark-infested waters or facing a bullet to the head. Your modern understanding of human rights, of the sanctity of life, would be utterly meaningless in this brutal hierarchy where survival of the fittest and the most ruthless was the only law that truly mattered. The concept of due process would be as alien to these men as a smartphone. Let's delve deeper into the sheer lack of privacy. You, who cherish your alone time, your quiet moments, your ability to retreat into your own space, would find this aspect of pirate life particularly maddening. There was no my room, no my corner. Every moment of your existence was spent in the immediate vicinity of dozens, sometimes hundreds of other men. Eating, sleeping, working, even performing the most basic bodily functions, it was all done in public, or at least within earshot and smell of everyone else. The head, as mentioned, was often just a plank or a small exposed area at the bow. Imagine trying to maintain any semblance of dignity while relieving yourself in full view of your shipmates as the ship pitches and rolls and the waves crash below. Your ingrained sense of modesty, your need for personal boundaries, would be utterly shattered within hours. And your possessions, what few you might have brought with you, would be constantly at risk. There was no concept of a locked locker, no personal safe. Everything you owned was stored in a sea chest or a simple bag, perpetually vulnerable to theft. Trust was a luxury rarely afforded, and even then often misplaced. Your modern attachment to your gadgets, your clothes, your sentimental items would be a liability. You'd learn quickly to own nothing, to desire nothing, save for survival itself. The mental landscape was equally barren. You, with your access to information, to books, to diverse opinions and stimulating conversations, would find yourself adrift in a sea of ignorance and superstition. Most pirates were illiterate, their worldview shaped by the harsh realities of their lives and the crude, often violent, tales spun during long watches. Superstition was rampant, fear of sea monsters, bad omens, the spirits of the drowned. Every creak of the ship, every unusual wave, every strange cloud formation could be interpreted as a sign of impending doom. Your rational, scientific mind would be utterly out of place, constantly battling against the ingrained fears and beliefs of your shipmates. The language itself would be a challenge, not just the archaic slang, but the sheer lack of polite discourse. Communication was often blunt, crude, and laced with profanity. Arguments were common and often escalated quickly from shouting to physical violence. Your finely tuned social graces, your ability to navigate complex conversations with nuance and empathy would be utterly useless. You'd learn to speak simply, directly, and often aggressively, or you'd be walked all over. Let's revisit the culinary nightmare, because it truly deserves more attention. The cook, often a one-eyed, peg-legged fellow whose personal hygiene was even worse than the rest of the crew, would be preparing your meals in a cramped, greasy galley, usually over an open fire that swayed precariously with the ship's motion. Sanitation was a foreign concept. Imagine the cross-contamination. Imagine the flies, the cockroaches, the rats that would inevitably share your dining space. The food, already of questionable quality, would be handled with utter disregard for anything resembling cleanliness. You'd be eating with your fingers, from a communal wooden platter, likely sharing the meal with others who hadn't washed their hands in weeks. Every meal would be a gamble, a roll of the dice on whether you'd end up with a fresh bout of dysentery. And the water, that most basic necessity. We touched on its foulness, but let's be explicit. The wooden casks it was stored in were rarely cleaned. Algae, slime, and various forms of microbial life would thrive within. The water would be cloudy, often greenish, and taste like a swamp, with a distinct, unsettling odor. to make it remotely drinkable, it was often purified by being mixed with rum. So you were essentially choosing between chronic dehydration, dysentery, or a constant state of mild inebriation and liver damage. Your modern access to filtered, clean, potable water, available on demand, would feel like a miracle. You'd dream of a tall glass of ice water, a fantasy as unattainable as a private jet. The very concept of freedom on a pirate ship, the allure that drew so many desperate men to this life, was a twisted irony. Yes, you were free from the tyrannical grip of a merchant captain, free from the crushing poverty of land, free from the rigid class structures of society. But you were enslaved by the ship, by the sea, by the brutal hierarchy of the crew, and by your own desperate circumstances. You were free to live a short, brutal, and utterly miserable life, constantly on the run, constantly facing death, constantly battling disease and starvation. Your freedom was merely the freedom to suffer in a different way. You, with your carefully constructed life, your aspirations, your hopes, your dreams, would find them all crumbling in the face of this relentless, all-consuming struggle for basic survival. Your mental fortitude, honed by navigating social media algorithms and office politics, would be utterly unprepared for the raw, visceral challenge of simply staying alive, day after day, in a world that actively sought to kill you. The psychological trauma of constant fear, of witnessing extreme violence, of living in perpetual filth, would leave you a broken husk of your former self. You develop a 1,000-yard stare, a twitch, a nervous tic, and a profound, bone-deep appreciation for indoor plumbing. The romantic image of the pirate, swaggering with a treasure chest, is a cruel deception. The reality of plunder was often disappointing. Most merchant ships carried mundane cargo, textiles, provisions, timber, not chests of gold and jewels. And whatever was found had to be divided amongst the entire crew, often hundreds of men. Your share might amount to a few coins, quickly squandered in the next port on cheap rum, questionable women, and gambling, leaving you just as destitute as before, and often with a fresh venereal disease for good measure. The concept of saving for retirement, of investing, of financial planning, would be utterly laughable. Your wealth was as fleeting as a favorable wind. So the next time you fantasize about the golden age of piracy, take a moment to truly consider the gritty, unvarnished truth. Consider the gnawing hunger, the constant thirst, the pervasive stench, the ever-present threat of disease and dismemberment. Consider the relentless labor, the brutal discipline, the utter lack of privacy, and the soul-crushing boredom punctuated by moments of pure terror. Consider the weevils in your biscuit, the rats in your hammock, and the sheer, overwhelming misery of it all. You wouldn't last a day. You wouldn't last an hour. You'd be a whimpering, feverish, lice-ridden mess, begging for the sweet release of a quick drowning. And honestly, who could blame you? The sea is a cruel mistress, and a pirate ship, her most unforgiving boudoir. Let's talk about the view. You, with your Instagram-perfect sunsets and your meticulously framed landscape shots, would find yourself staring at the same endless, featureless expanse of water day after day, week after week. The horizon, a perpetual line separating the gray sky from the gray sea, would become a torment. There are no changing seasons to observe from a comfortable window, no new vistas to explore with a carefully planned itinerary. It's just water and sky. And the occasional, terrifying storm cloud, or the even more terrifying distant sail. The sheer, mind-numbing monotony of it all would be a psychological torture of the highest order. Your brain, accustomed to a constant stream of novel stimuli, would begin to short-circuit, starved of anything new or interesting to process. You'd find yourself counting the barnacles on the hull, or perhaps the threads in a frayed rope, just to give your mind something, anything, to latch onto. The concept of ocean therapy would be violently disabused from your mind, replaced by ocean-induced psychosis. And the isolation. While you're surrounded by dozens of men, you are utterly, profoundly isolated from the world you know. No news from home, no letters, no idea if your family is alive or dead, if your dog misses you, if your favorite coffee shop has a new seasonal latte. You are a ghost, cut off from civilization, existing in a floating purgatory. This isn't a digital detox. This is an existential void. The lack of any new faces, any new conversations beyond the crude banter and repetitive stories of your shipmates would slowly erode your social skills, leaving you adrift in a sea of your own increasingly unhinged thoughts. You'd find yourself talking to the rats, or perhaps to a particularly interesting patch of mildew on the bulkheads, just for the sheer relief of hearing a different voice, even if it was your own, slowly descending into madness. Consider, too, the constant motion sickness. You might think you have a strong stomach. Perhaps you've even braved a choppy ferry ride without incident. But a pirate ship, particularly in the open ocean, is a perpetually lurching, pitching, rolling beast. Even in calm seas, there's a subtle, relentless motion that would slowly, inexorably, wear down your equilibrium. And in a storm, oh, the glorious, gut-wrenching agony. Every meal would be a gamble, every movement a dizzying challenge. You'd be perpetually nauseous, constantly fighting the urge to vomit and often losing. The deck, slick with spray and vomit, would become your personal hell. Your body, accustomed to stable ground, would be in a constant state of rebellion, screaming for the sweet, solid embrace of land. And when you finally did reach land, you'd find yourself still swaying, still feeling the phantom rocking of the ship, a cruel reminder of your ordeal, long after you stepped off the gangplank. Then there's the noise, a constant, oppressive presence. Beyond the creaking timbers and crashing waves, imagine the perpetual din of dozens of men crammed into a small space. Shouting, cursing, the clang of tools, the thud of bare feet on wood, the raucous laughter, the drunken arguments, the occasional burst of violence. There was no quiet corner, no soundproofing, no escape from the relentless auditory assault. Even when you tried to sleep, the snores of your shipmates, the scratching of rats, the groan of the ship, and the relentless slap of the waves against the hull would conspire to deny you any true rest. Your modern need for quiet, for moments of peaceful contemplation, would be utterly unfulfilled. You'd be perpetually exhausted, your nerves frayed, your temper short, a walking bundle of raw sensory input. And what about the sheer physical discomfort of every surface? There were no soft furnishings, no comfortable chairs, no plush carpets. Every surface was hard, rough, often damp, and frequently splintery. The wooden deck, the rough ropes, the hard benches, the unforgiving hammocks, your body, accustomed to the gentle embrace of modern ergonomics, would be in a constant state of low-grade agony. Your back would ache, your joints would protest, and every movement would be accompanied by a subtle, persistent discomfort. You'd be perpetually sore, perpetually stiff, and perpetually yearning for the simple luxury of a soft pillow. Let's consider the state of your teeth. Even if you somehow avoided scurvy, which is a big if, your dental hygiene would be non-existent. No toothbrushes, no toothpaste, no regular dental checkups. Your teeth would quickly succumb to decay, cavities, and gum disease. Every meal would be a painful ordeal, every bite a potential source of agony. Infections would be common, leading to abscesses that would swell your face, causing unbearable pain and potentially spreading to your jaw or even your brain. The only dentistry available would be a shipmate with a pair of rusty pliers, ready to yank out the offending tooth without any anesthetic. Your modern fear of a routine dental cleaning would be replaced by a primal dread of every meal, every ache, every twinge in your mouth. You'd be a toothless, gum-bleeding mess before your first month was out. The smell, oh, the glorious, ever-present smell. We talked about the general stench, but let's get specific. Imagine the smell of hundreds of unwashed men, not just their bodies, but their breath, decaying teeth, rum, stale food, and the general miasma of disease. Imagine the smell of a ship's hold, perpetually damp and dark, where provisions slowly rotted, where rats thrived, and where the air was thick with the scent of mildew, bilge, and despair. This wasn't a temporary odor. It was a permanent, suffocating presence that would seep into your very soul. You'd never truly get rid of it, even if you somehow made it back to land. Your modern nose, accustomed to the faint scent of laundry detergent and fresh coffee, would be utterly overwhelmed, perhaps even permanently damaged. And the food again, beyond the weevils and the rancid meat, Imagine the sheer lack of variety. Day after day, the same monotonous, bland, unappetizing fare. Your palate, accustomed to a global smorgasbord of flavors and textures, would be in a constant state of protest. You crave fresh fruit, crisp vegetables, anything with a hint of spice or sweetness. But all you'd get is more hardtack, more salted meat, and perhaps, if you were lucky, some boiled peas or beans, equally devoid of flavor or nutritional value. The joy of eating, a simple pleasure you take for granted, would be replaced by a grim, necessary ritual of survival, forcing down sustenance that your body actively rejected. The concept of shore leave sounds appealing, doesn't it? A chance to stretch your legs, perhaps find some fresh food, maybe even a moment of fleeting pleasure in a taverna. But shore leave for a pirate was often just as dangerous as life at sea, if not more so. Ports were cesspools of disease, crime, and treachery. You'd be an obvious target for thieves, press gangs, who would happily Shanghai you onto a legitimate ship, forcing you into naval service, or even agents of the crown looking for a quick bounty. Any money you managed to acquire would be quickly squandered on cheap rum, gambling, and prostitutes, who were often disease-ridden and just as desperate as you were. You'd leave port with a lighter purse, a heavier hangover, and a high probability of having contracted a venereal disease, adding another layer of suffering to your already miserable existence. Your idea of a relaxing vacation, a safe, comfortable hotel, and a delicious meal would be a fantasy utterly divorced from the grim reality of a pirate's shore leave. And the psychological toll of violence. You, who are likely accustomed to resolving conflicts with words, perhaps even with the occasional strongly worded email, would be plunged into a world where violence was the primary language. Witnessing brutal floggings, summary executions, the gruesome aftermath of battles, it would harden you, or it would break you. The constant threat of being subjected to such violence yourself, or of having to inflict it upon others, would slowly erode your empathy, your humanity. You'd become desensitized, or you'd live in a constant state of terror, a nervous wreck. The concept of PTSD, though unnamed at the time, would be a very real companion for any pirate who survived more than a few skirmishes. Your modern aversion to blood, your gentle sensibilities, would be utterly obliterated by the raw, visceral reality of combat and punishment. The absolute lack of control over your own destiny. Once you signed on or were forced on a pirate ship, your life was no longer your own. You were at the mercy of the captain, the crew, the weather, and the ever-present Royal Navy. Your future was a coin toss, a roll of the dice. You could die in a storm, in battle, from disease, from starvation, from a simple accident, or at the end of a hangman's rope. There was no long-term planning, no retirement fund, no comfortable old age to look forward to. Every day was a struggle for survival, and the future was a bleak, uncertain void. Your modern need for stability, for a career path, for a sense of agency, would be utterly crushed by the arbitrary, brutal realities of pirate life. You'd be a pawn in a desperate, deadly game with no hope of winning. And the final chilling thought, what if you did survive? What if you made it through the storms, the battles, the diseases, and the constant threat of capture? What kind of person would you be? You'd be a hardened, scarred, probably disfigured wreck of a human being. Your body would be ravaged by disease and injury, your mind twisted by trauma and deprivation. You'd be an outcast, a criminal, forever hunted by the law, unable to return to any semblance of normal life. The treasure you might have accumulated would be fleeting, quickly spent, leaving you with nothing but your memories of horror and the constant, nagging fear of the gallows. Your modern expectation of a happy ending, of overcoming adversity to achieve success, would be a cruel, fantastical joke. So when you next encounter the romanticized image of a pirate, the dashing rogue, the charming adventurer, remember the reality. Remember the smell of fear and filth, the taste of weevils and rancid meat, the constant ache of your body, the gnawing hunger, the ever-present threat of a gruesome death. Remember the lack of privacy, the brutal discipline, the soul-crushing boredom, and the utter, profound misery that was the daily bread of a pirate's existence. you wouldn't last a day, you wouldn't last an hour. You'd be a sobbing, shivering, feverish mess, begging for the sweet release of a well-aimed cannonball. And honestly, who could blame you? The sea is a cruel mistress and a pirate ship, her most unforgiving boudoir. But don't stop, we'll continue. We've discussed the general lack of hygiene, but let's zoom in on the microscopic horrors that would be your constant, intimate companions. Forget the occasional mosquito bite or the fleeting annoyance of a housefly. On a pirate ship, you were a walking, talking ecosystem for every parasitic creature known to man. Lice, fleas, and bed bugs. Oh yes, they were all there, thriving in the damp, unwashed hammocks and clothes. Imagine the incessant, maddening itch. Not just a minor irritation, but a constant, crawling sensation that would drive you to distraction. You'd scratch until your skin bled, creating open sores that would inevitably become infected in the putrid environment. Your modern aversion to a single mosquito bite would be utterly shattered by the sheer, overwhelming, and continuous assault of these tiny, blood-sucking tormentors. Sleep, already elusive, would become a desperate, fitful battle against 1,000 tiny teeth. And then there were the rats, not just a few scurrying in the shadows, but legions of them, bold, fearless, and utterly ubiquitous. They gnawed through everything: ropes, provisions, even the ship's timbers. They carried diseases, contaminating what little food and water was available. And at night, they would scurry over your sleeping body, occasionally nipping at exposed fingers or toes. Imagine the sheer terror of waking up to the sensation of a rat gnawing on your earlobe. Your urban fear of a single mouse in your kitchen would seem laughably quaint in comparison to the nightly rodent infestation that was a standard feature of pirate ship life. They were simply a part of the crew, albeit an unwelcome, disease-ridden one. Let's talk about the constant, bone-chilling dampness. A wooden ship at sea is a perpetually wet environment. Sea spray, rain, condensation, and the insidious dampness that seeped into every crack and crevice meant that nothing was ever truly dry. Your clothes, your hammock, your few paltry possessions, all would be perpetually clammy, stiff with salt and moisture. Imagine the constant chill that would penetrate your bones, the lingering mildewy smell that would cling to everything. Your modern aversion to slightly damp laundry would be violently disabused. You'd dream of a warm, dry blanket, a simple luxury as unattainable as a Michelin star meal. This constant dampness wasn't just uncomfortable. It led to chronic aches, pains, and a susceptibility to respiratory illnesses that, without modern medicine, could easily turn fatal. And the light, or rather, the lack of it below deck. Your modern eyes, accustomed to brightly lit rooms and the glowing screens of your devices, would struggle in the perpetual gloom. Below deck, the only illumination came from a few flickering lanterns, which were a constant fire hazard on a wooden ship laden with gunpowder. The air would be thick with smoke and the stench of burning oil. During the day, the deck could be blindingly bright with sunlight reflecting off the water, causing eye strain and headaches. At night, it was pitch black, save for the stars or the occasional flash of lightning. Your circadian rhythm, finely tuned by artificial lighting and regular sleep patterns, would be utterly destroyed. You'd be perpetually disoriented, struggling to see in the dim light, and prone to tripping over unseen obstacles. The threat of fire, incidentally, was a constant, terrifying reality. A wooden ship, packed with highly flammable pitch, tar, and gunpowder, was a floating tinderbox. A stray spark from a lantern, a cooking fire, or even a carelessly discarded pipe could turn your entire world into a raging inferno within minutes. There were no sophisticated fire suppression systems, no sprinklers, no fire alarms. The only solution was often to scuttle the ship, or simply to jump overboard and pray you didn't drown or get eaten by sharks. Imagine the sheer, heart-stopping terror of hearing the cry of fire on a wooden vessel in the middle of the ocean. Your modern fire drills and smoke detectors would seem like quaint, unnecessary luxuries in the face of such an immediate, all-consuming threat. And the rigging, we briefly touched upon it, but let's be clear. Climbing the masts and yardarms was a daily, perilous task. Imagine scaling hundreds of feet of rope and timber, often in high winds with the ship pitching and rolling beneath you. Your hands, raw and blistered, would struggle to maintain a grip. A single gust of wind, a moment of dizziness, a frayed rope, or a misstep could send you plummeting to your death on the hard deck below, or worse, into the churning, unforgiving sea. Your fear of heights, your lack of physical agility, your soft hands, all would conspire to make this a terrifying, life-threatening ordeal every single time. And the constant strain on your muscles and joints would leave you in perpetual agony. Let's consider the lack of any true personal belongings or sentimental value. You, with your photo albums, your cherished trinkets, your carefully curated collections, would find yourself stripped bare. What few items you possessed would be purely functional: a knife, a spare shirt, a pipe. There was no space for sentimentality, no room for keepsakes. Everything was practical, utilitarian, and easily replaceable. The emotional void left by this absence of personal connection to objects would be profound. You'd learn to detach, to exist without the comforting presence of familiar things, a stark contrast to your modern world of consumerism and accumulation. The boredom, that insidious, pervasive boredom, would be interspersed with moments of sheer terror, but even the terror was often followed by more boredom. There were no hobbies, no creative outlets, no intellectual pursuits beyond crude gambling and storytelling. Your brain, accustomed to constant stimulation from the internet, books, music, and social interaction, would simply atrophy. You'd find yourself staring blankly at the horizon, your mind slowly turning to mush, fantasizing about the simplest pleasures: a fresh meal, a soft bed, a moment of quiet. The silence, when it came, would be deafening, filled only with the creaks of the ship and the whispers of your own encroaching madness. And the constant, gnawing hunger. Even when food was available, it was often barely enough to sustain you, and certainly not nutritious. You'd be perpetually running on empty, your body slowly consuming itself, your energy levels perpetually low. This wasn't just missing a meal, this was chronic, systemic undernourishment. Your modern concept of being hungry, a slight grumble before your next gourmet meal, would be violently redefined by the true, desperate ache of starvation, a constant companion that would erode your strength, your focus, and your will to live. Finally, the psychological burden of being an outlaw. You were constantly hunted, constantly on the run. Every sail on the horizon could be a Royal Navy warship. Every port could hold a trap. You could never truly relax, never truly feel safe. This constant state of paranoia, of looking over your shoulder, would wear down your nerves, leaving you a perpetually anxious wreck. Your modern sense of security, of living within the bounds of law and order, would be utterly shattered. You'd be a fugitive, forever looking for the next hiding place, the next desperate gamble for survival. We'll continue this delightful journey into the annals of maritime misery, because we've only just begun to plumb the depths of what would truly break your meticulously curated modern self. Let's talk about the absolute intellectual void you'd find yourself adrift in. You, with your podcasts, your documentaries, your endless scroll of information and opinion, would be plunged into an era where knowledge was scarce and often irrelevant to your daily survival. Beyond the practical skills of sailing and fighting, there was little to stimulate the mind. Conversations revolved around the weather, the last port, the next potential prize, and endlessly retold, often exaggerated, tales of past exploits. There were no books, save for perhaps a battered Bible or a navigation chart. No philosophical debates, no scientific discussions, no exploration of complex ideas. Your brain, accustomed to being constantly fed a diet of diverse information, would slowly starve. You'd find yourself craving the most basic forms of mental engagement, perhaps even resorting to trying to count the stars, if the clouds weren't perpetually obscuring them. The sheer, unadulterated intellectual boredom would be a torture for your modern, stimulated mind, leaving you feeling dull, uninspired, and increasingly desperate for any form of mental exercise beyond calculating how many weevils were in your biscuit. and the lack of any form of emotional comfort or support. You, with your carefully constructed support networks, your friends, your family, your therapists, would find yourself utterly alone in a sea of hardened, often brutal men. Grief for lost shipmates was a luxury rarely afforded. They were simply replaced. Loneliness, despite being surrounded by dozens of others, would be a constant, gnawing companion. There was no space for vulnerability, no shoulder to cry on, no one to share your fears or anxieties with. Any display of weakness could be exploited, making you a target. You'd learn to suppress your emotions, to harden your heart, or you'd simply break under the immense psychological pressure. The concept of mental health was as alien to these men as quantum physics. Your modern need for connection, for empathy, for a safe space to process your feelings would be utterly unfulfilled, leaving you emotionally adrift and profoundly isolated. Let's delve deeper into the sheer, unadulterated filth of the ship's hold. Beyond the general stench of unwashed bodies and bilge water, imagine the specific aroma of rotting provisions. Barrels of salted meat going bad, their brine turning putrid. Sacks of hardtack infested with weevils and mold. The acrid smell of gunpowder, tar, and pitch. The faint, unsettling aroma of animal waste if they had live chickens or pigs on board. The hold was a dark, damp, airless cavern, a breeding ground for every imaginable form of bacterial and fungal growth. The air itself would be thick and cloying, a suffocating blanket of decay. Your modern nose, accustomed to filtered, fresh air, would simply recoil, perhaps even cause you to gag repeatedly. This wasn't just an unpleasant smell. It was a constant, pervasive reminder of the ship's slow, organic decay and the unsanitary conditions that contributed to rampant disease. And the food again, because it bears repeating just how truly awful it was. Imagine the preparation. The ship's cook, often a man with questionable hygiene and even more questionable culinary skills, would be preparing your meals in a cramped, greasy galley, often over an open fire that swayed precariously with the ship's motion. There was no refrigeration, no concept of food safety. Meat would be cut with unwashed knives on unwashed surfaces. Water, already foul, would be used for cooking. The stew would be a gray, greasy concoction of whatever was available, often indistinguishable in taste or texture. Maggots in the meat were a common occurrence, not a reason to discard it, but simply an extra source of protein. Your modern aversion to even slightly undercooked chicken would be utterly laughable in the face of the daily culinary Russian roulette that was a pirate's mealtime. Every bite would be a gamble, a test of your gag reflex, and a potential pathway to a fresh bout of dysentery. Consider the constant, low-grade fear of betrayal from your own shipmates. While pirates often had a code and a democratic structure, it was a fragile peace. These were desperate men, often with violent pasts, and loyalty was a fluid concept. A larger share of plunder, a perceived slight, a drunken argument, any of these could escalate into a deadly confrontation. You'd always be watching your back, wary of who might be plotting against you, who might have a grudge. The concept of a safe work environment would be utterly foreign. Your modern expectation of collegiality, of a team dynamic based on mutual respect, would be brutally disabused by the harsh reality of a pirate crew, where suspicion and self-preservation often trumped camaraderie. And the sheer, unadulterated violence of the era. It wasn't just limited to battles. Life itself was brutal. Accidents were common and often fatal. A falling block, a snapping rope, a slip on a wet deck, any of these could end your life in an instant or leave you crippled and useless, a burden to the crew. There was no compensation for injury, no disability benefits. If you couldn't work, you were a liability, and liabilities were often dealt with harshly. Your modern world, with its safety regulations, its protective gear, its emphasis on risk assessment, would seem like an impossible utopia. You'd be living in a constant state of low-level anxiety, knowing that death or dismemberment could strike at any moment, from any direction, often from the very tools and environment you relied upon for survival. The arbitrary nature of justice. While pirate crews had their codes, the enforcement was often summary and brutal. There were no appeals, no higher courts, no legal aid. The captain's word, backed by the quartermaster, was often law, and if you were captured by the authorities, your fate was sealed. The British Navy was notoriously brutal, and a pirate captured was a pirate hanged. The concept of innocent until proven guilty, of a fair trial, of legal representation, would be utterly meaningless. Your modern expectation of due process would be met with a swift, cold noose. You'd be stripped of all rights, reduced to a mere body awaiting the gallows, a chilling reminder of the arbitrary power wielded by the state. And the lack of any form of meaningful personal hygiene. We've touched on it, but let's be explicit. There was no toilet paper, no flush toilets. The head was a plank over the side, exposed to the elements, offering no privacy, and often slick with spray and the accumulated waste of previous users. Imagine trying to maintain any semblance of cleanliness or dignity in such conditions, particularly in rough seas. The humiliation, the discomfort, and the sheer unsanitary nature of it all would be profoundly distressing for your modern sensibilities. You'd be perpetually dirty, perpetually uncomfortable, and perpetually longing for the simple luxury of a clean, private bathroom. The sheer grinding fatigue, between the constant labor, the poor diet, the lack of proper sleep, and the perpetual anxiety, you'd be in a constant state of exhaustion. Your body would ache, your mind would be sluggish, and your reactions would be slow. This wasn't just feeling tired after a long day. This was bone-deep, chronic fatigue that would permeate every aspect of your being, making every task a monumental effort and every moment of rest a desperate, fleeting luxury. Your modern reliance on caffeine and energy drinks would be utterly useless in the face of such profound physical and mental depletion. You'd be a walking zombie, perpetually on the verge of collapse. Let's consider the ultimate futility of it all. You, with your grand ambitions, your long-term plans, your desire for a comfortable retirement and a legacy, would find none of that in the pirate life. The riches were often fleeting, quickly squandered in a drunken spree in the next port, leaving you just as destitute and desperate as before. There was no concept of saving, no investment, no building a future. Your life was a series of desperate gambles, each one potentially your last. The treasure chests of lore were largely mythical. Most ships carried mundane cargo, not glittering hoards of gold. And what gold was found was divided amongst a large, greedy crew, leaving each man with a pittance quickly frittered away on vice and fleeting pleasures. Your modern understanding of financial planning, of building generational wealth, would be a concept so alien it would make your pirate shipmates laugh until they coughed up blood and weevils. The sheer, overwhelming pointlessness of it all would eventually settle in. You'd be living a life of constant hardship, danger, and deprivation, with no real hope of escape or improvement. Every day would be a struggle for survival, punctuated by moments of terror, and the only reward was the dubious privilege of living to face another equally miserable day. There was no glory, no honor, no lasting legacy beyond a potential entry in a Royal Navy wanted poster. Your modern search for meaning, for purpose, for a life that contributes to something larger than yourself, would be brutally extinguished by the sheer, grinding reality of piracy. You'd be reduced to a primal state of existence, driven solely by the instinct to survive, with all higher aspirations stripped away by the relentless cruelty of the sea and the desperate company you kept. And then there's the constant, unspoken fear that would cling to you like the damp, salt-laden air. The fear of being caught, of course, leading to the public spectacle of the gallows, but also the fear of being abandoned, of being marooned, of being deemed useless and cast aside. The fear of a lingering, agonizing death from disease or injury, far from any comfort or care. The fear of the unknown, of the vast, indifferent ocean swallowing you whole. This wasn't a fleeting anxiety. It was a deep-seated, pervasive dread that would permeate every cell of your being, slowly eroding your sanity and your will. Your modern anxieties about traffic, deadlines, or social media faux pas would seem like delightful distractions compared to the existential terror of a pirate's daily existence. So when you next encounter the romanticized image of a pirate, The dashing rogue, the charming adventurer, the free spirit. Remember the reality. Remember the intellectual void, the emotional isolation, the putrid stench of the hold, the maggot-ridden food, the constant threat of betrayal from your own shipmates, the arbitrary brutality of justice, the lack of basic hygiene, the soul-crushing fatigue, the utter futility of it all, and the pervasive, all-consuming fear that would be your constant companion. Remember that the golden age of piracy was a brief, brutal, and utterly miserable existence for the vast majority who dared to live it. You wouldn't last a day, you wouldn't last an hour. You'd be a whimpering, feverish, lice-ridden mess, begging for the sweet release of a quick drowning. And honestly, who could blame you? The sea is a cruel mistress, and a pirate ship her most unforgiving boudoir. So perhaps the next time you feel a pang of wanderlust, a longing for adventure, just take a moment to appreciate the truly miraculous comforts of your own, perfectly mundane, perfectly clean, perfectly safe modern life. Because trust me, the romance of the high seas is far better enjoyed from the safety of your couch, with a clean blanket, a hot drink, and absolutely no weevils.